comments, actions by this nominee shows he lacks the character and competence for this job. I've talked about roughly half a dozen various different facts in his background, statements, comments, actions that would be individually disqualifying. Altogether, they paint a picture of someone who has no proper role anywhere near a law enforcement agency, let alone director of the FBI. I'm appalled that my Republican colleagues voted for him in committee unanimously on their side. I'm appalled that so few may vote against him on the floor today. But I am absolutely sure of this one thing. This vote will haunt anyone who votes for him. They will rue the day they did it. To my Republican colleagues, think about it. Think about what you will tell your constituents, more important, your family, maybe your grandchildren, about why you picked and voted for this person who will so completely and utterly disgrace this office and do such grave damage to our nation's justice system. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
President, I ask permission to speak up to 10 minutes.
Without objection, the senator from Vermont is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President, and I thank my colleagues for joining me here today. I oppose Kash Patel and believe he is the dangerously wrong choice to serve as the director of FBI. We all have great admiration for the FBI. The men and women there serve our nation, do hard work every day, and for decades they've served as a non-political agency that protects us and defends the rule of law. I believe that Mr. Patel is on a mission to wreck the FBI. It's his own words. He wants to turn the FBI building into a monument or museum to the deep state. You know, I believe that this country and Congress is in the midst of a slow-moving but rapidly accelerating constitutional crisis. This is real, and we can ignore it or see it. It began most visibly, of course, in January 6, 2021, when two norms of this republic, the peaceful transfer of power and the renunciation of violence to affect the outcome of a vote count and certification, were breached, and where many members of the House and Senate also voted against certifying the election of the person chosen by the people in their own states. The president continues to say that the election was stolen, and he has coached his nominees to embrace the big lie. Mr. President, the first month of the Trump administration has shown a contempt for the Constitution, an acceptance of lawlessness that is dangerous to the future of our republic. President Trump's election denialism was only an early sign of his disregard for the norms and requirements of the Constitution. Now empowered in his second term by a Congress and a judiciary which refused to assert their independence, Mr. Trump has enacted executive order after executive order to dismantle our institutions. He doesn't have the authority to do what he's doing. The federal funding freeze, clearly unconstitutional, invasion of the Article I power of the purse, shutting down agencies created by Congress without authority, revoking birthright citizenship, a constitutional provision that he asserts he can do by executive order, removing leaders of independent agencies created by Congress, clearly unlawful, firing inspectors general in violation of notice requirements created by Congress, unlawful, firing government employees who have civil service protections, clearly unlawful, and pushing, really, a quid pro quo order at the Department of Justice to drop charges against a corrupt mayor in New York, so he'll accede to whatever the wishes are of the Trump administration regarding local enforcement. And that's only a short list. And we have reached a point where a federal judge has found that the White House defied his order to release billions of dollars in federal grants, marking the first time that a judge has expressly declared that the Trump administration is disobeying a judicial mandate. That is trouble. The country is headed into a situation where, in addition to acting without authority, the president and his enablers are indicting. He will defy rulings from the third branch of our government. Vice President Vance has made it very clear what his point of view is on judges. Judges aren't allowed to control the executive's, quote, legitimate powers. And if the courts don't like it, let them enforce it. Of course, under our Constitution, since Marbury versus Madison, the court is the final arbiter of what is legitimate or what is not. And the executive branch must enforce the laws as interpreted by the co-equal branch of government. Mr. President, it is my view that this administration is showing maximum contempt for core constitutional values, including, most importantly, the separation of powers. This is not about what the president's agenda is. This is about his disregard about the limits that apply to each branch of government. And we have a dilemma. There are many in Congress that are fully in support of President Trump's policies. That's his right to pursue them, any member's right to support them. But it has to be that we accept our unique responsibility, each of the 100 U.S. senators, that we have to guarantee that in pursuit of those policies, it is done within constitutional boundaries. That is the glue that has held this country together through thick and thin for nearly 250 years. You know, this is not just talk about civic aspiration. It's a recognition that the separation of powers, that the system of checks and balances, we're custodians of that, each of us here, that the concept of the executive's ambition should be matched with the ambition of the legislature. That's what's held us together through the turmoil of our own history. We have fierce debates about important public policy matters, but what allows us to resolve them, despite intense disagreements, is staying within the guardrails of the Constitution. That process is being threatened directly and aggressively. The president's attack on our Constitution on January 6th has continued to this day. We've witnessed a renunciation of the decision that the American people made in the 2020 election by President Trump's nominees. Many of them who came before us, including Mr. Patel, were unable to simply say who won the 2020 election. They continued the Stop the Steal narrative even 4 years later. And now we have President Trump in his first month in office acting in ways that continues to challenge the constitutional order. I'm voting against Mr. Patel primarily, but not exclusively, because he's clearly an instrument in that effort to continue eroding the precepts of the Constitution on separation of powers. And I urge all my fellow senators, Republican and Democrats, to embrace the responsibility we have to assert our responsibility and authority as a co-equal branch. This is a difficult time, particularly for many of my esteemed colleagues on the Republican side. You may support, as I mentioned, the policies of the president, but we've got to take a look at how he is going about trying to implement them. That really matters. We are all custodians of the constitutional order. I'm regarding what President Trump has been doing in his first month in office as an illegal rampage. It's a rampage of illegality. He's showing a contempt for Congress and a contempt for the United States judiciary. Mr. Patel has signed on to that agenda. He isn't just someone who will be forced to participate in the president's campaign of retribution. He's an active participant. He's got his enemies list. We know this because his own words said what was the FBI doing planning January 6th for a year? No basis for that other than to set up the attack on the good men and women of the FBI. Mr. Patel is the one who created a list of deep state individuals. This is like Russia kind of stuff, half of whom are Republicans in the so-called deep state. And he called it nothing more than a cabal of government gangsters and allies. This is the department he's going to be leading, really. And he's the one who said thank you to President Trump for helping put so many government gangsters in their place. Mr. President, Mr. Patel is not the person to lead the FBI. And my hope is that all of us should consider what Mr. Patel will do. He's going to use the power of the FBI to go after all those in government, those in the media, and those across the country he doesn't agree with. He cannot serve as the next director of the FBI. I yield back.
All post-cloture time has expired. The question occurs on the nomination. Do I hear a sufficient second? There appears to be a sufficient second. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Alsobrooks, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Banks, Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Bennett. Mrs. Blackburn. Mr. Blumenthal. Ms. Blunt-Rochester. Mr. Booker. Mr. Bozeman, Mrs. Brett, Mr. Budd, Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito, Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Curtis, Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Ms. Ernst, Mr. Fetterman, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Gallego, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mr. Haggerty, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich, Mr. Hickenlooper. Ms. Hirono. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Husted. Mrs. Hyde-Smith. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Justice. Mr. Kane. Mr. Kelly. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. Kim. Mr. King. Ms. Klobuchar. Mr. Langford. Mr. Lee. Mr. Lujan. Ms. Lummis. Mr. Markey. Mr. Marshall. Mr. McConnell. Mr. McCormick. Mr. Merkley. Mrs. Moody. Mr. Moran. Mr. Moreno.
Aye.
Mr. Mullen. Ms. Murkowski. Mr. Murphy. Mrs. Murray. Mr. Ossoff. Mr. Padilla. Mr. Paul. Mr. Peters. Mr. Reed. Mr. Ricketts. Mr. Risch. Ms. Rosen. Mr. Rounds. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schiff. Mr. Schmidt. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Scott of Florida. Mr. Scott of South Carolina. Mrs. Shaheen. Mr. Sheehy. Ms. Slotkin. Ms. Smith. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Thune. Mr. Tillis. Mr. Tuberville. Mr. Van Hollen. Mr. Warner. Mr. Warnock. Sir. Ms. Warren. Mr. Welch. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Young. Senators voting in the affirmative: Banks, Barrasso, Blackburn, Britt, Budd, Cassidy, Cotton, Ernst, Grassley, Haggerty, Hawley, Hyde-Smith, Kennedy, Moreno, Paul, Schmidt, Scott of Florida, Tillis, and Young. Senators voting in the negative: Duckworth, Durbin, King, Lujan, Murkowski, Murphy, Padilla, Peters, Sanders, Warner, and Welch. Ms. Slotkin, no. Mr. Sheehy, aye. Mr. Schatz, no. Mrs. Moody, aye. Mr. Crapo, aye. Mr. Scott of South Carolina, aye. Ms. Rosen, no. Mr. Tuberville, aye. Mr. Husted, aye. Mr. Johnson, aye. Mr. Risch, aye. Mr. Kelly, no. Mr. Ricketts, aye. Mr. Blumenthal, no. Mr. Daines, aye. Mr. Justice, aye. Ms. Cantwell, no. Mr. Graham, aye. Ms. Collins, no. Mr. Marshall, aye. Ms. Lummis, aye. Mr. McCormick, aye. Mr. Schumer, no. Mrs. Gillibrand, no. Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Sullivan, aye. Mr. McConnell, Mr. McConnell, aye. Mr. Wyden, Mr. Wyden, no. Ms. Alsobrooks, Ms. Alsobrooks, no. Mr. Kramer, Mr. Kramer, aye. Ms. Blunt Rochester, Ms. Blunt Rochester, no. No. Mr. Kim, no. Mr. Merkley, no. Mr. Langford, aye. Mr. Kane, no. Mr. Warnock, no. Ms. Hirono, no. Mr. Booker, no. Mrs. Murray, no. Mr. Heinrich, no. Ms. Cortez Masto, no. Mr. Rounds, aye. Mr. Moran, aye. Mr. Reed, no. Mr. Thune, aye. Mr. Cornyn, aye. Ms. Warren, no. Ms. Hassan, no. Mr. Ossoff, no. Mr. Fetterman, no. Ms. Smith, no. Mr. Van Hollen, no. Mr. Markey, no. Mr. Coons, no. Ms. Baldwin, no. Mr. Hickenlooper, no. Mrs. Shaheen, no. Mr. Bozeman, aye. Ms. Klobuchar, no. Mr. Hoven, aye. Mr. Schiff, no. Mr. Bennett, no. Mrs. Capito, aye. Mr. Wicker, Aye. Mrs. Fisher, Mrs. Fisher, aye. Mr. Cruz, Mr. Cruz, aye. Mr. Mullen, aye. Mr. Lee, aye. Mr. Gallego, no. Mr. Curtis. Mr. Curtis, aye. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Whitehouse, no.
The yeas are 51, the nays are 49. The confirmation is confirmed. Under the previous order, the motion to reconsider is considered made and laid upon the table, and the President will be immediately notified of the Senate's actions. I recognize the senator from South Carolina.
Thank you very much to my colleagues. We'll soon be starting what is commonly called a vote-a-rama. If you've never been in one, it's okay. But no, it's a chance to have a spirited discussion and debate about policy and about the budget resolution. So what's happened here is that the Budget Committee reported out Senate Concurrent Resolution 7 that will allow through the reconciliation process the spending of money and the reduction of spending based on different committees. This resolution allows for $175 billion of border and immigration policy enhancements, but it doesn't spend a penny. It allows the Judiciary Committee and the Homeland Security Committee to come up with up to $175 billion plan to secure our border and do immigration reform. And what will happen is that those two committees, Mr. President, will work with the Trump administration to meet their priorities. There's nothing in this resolution directing one dime of spending, and no spending bill can be implemented without presidential signature. So I want to make sure that's clear. There's $150 billion in increased defense spending. Why? Because we have a lot of threats. Since the withdrawal of Afghanistan, radical Islam is on the rise. We've got a hot war with Russia and Ukraine. Israel's facing enemies on 7 sides. We've provided weapons to our allies in Ukraine and Israel. We've run out of 155 howitzer rounds for a while. We've got to reinforce our industrial base. We need more money into our military yesterday to make sure that we can deter a war, and if we get into a war, we win it. So the $150 billion will be allocated by the Armed Services Committee. We don't direct how the $150 billion is spent. We just allow the Armed Services Committee to spend that much if they choose. They decide what to spend it on. So this idea that there's somehow money in this resolution for Ukraine or any other specific purpose is not true. All we do is create a number for the committees to mark up to, and it's up to the committee as to what is in the $150 billion package. And to all the colleagues here, you'll eventually get to vote on that work product. And if you don't like it, you can vote no, and eventually that work product will have to be signed by the president. So that's the way the process works. But what we're doing today is jump-starting a process that will allow the Republican Party to meet President Trump's immigration agenda through the reconciliation process, and the Democrats used this very process to pass Obamacare and the Inflation Reduction Act. We're going to use it to secure our border. We're not going to grow the government just for the sense of growing the government. We're not going to create the Green New Deal. We're going to create border security transformational in nature. Ladies and gentlemen, we're about to embark on a plan to jumpstart the most transformational border security bill in the history of the United States, because we need it yesterday. We've had 11 million people come to this country legally. Fentanyl kills 3,000 Americans every 2 weeks. It comes across that southern border. We're running out of detention space to hold people. Tom Homan, the border czar, came to the Republican Senate last week or 2 weeks ago and said that ICE is out of money. This resolution jumpstarts the process to get Tom Homan the money he needs to fill the promises we made, to build more detention beds so you don't have to let people go. Laken Riley's murderer was in detention and released because of lack of bed space, wound up killing the young lady. That should never happen again. When you're detained, we should hold you and process you according to law, not release you. We need more detention beds. We need to finish the wall. This $175 billion will be allocated by the committees in question, and it will allow President Trump to finish the wall, secure the border, and deport criminals. ICE is out of money. If you think it's a good idea to go after the criminal gangs that have come here over the years illegally, then you're right. To my Democratic colleagues, you should be working with us, not against us. Everybody should want to clean up the mess of the last 4 years. Everybody should want to go after criminal gangs. Everybody should want to secure the border because it's a national security nightmare. And nobody should want the dilemma of a nation having to let somebody go who could potentially be dangerous because you have no place to put them. This $175 billion will allow the most transformational border security bill in the history of the country at a time of great need. The $150 billion will be allocated by the Armed Services Committee. They'll decide what to spend it on, but there's a lot of modernization we need of our nuclear triad fleet. We need more weapons. Our stockpile is low. There's a bunch of things we can spend $150 billion on, but we'll let the Armed Services Committee decide those priorities. When it comes to the border security, $175 billion plan, the committees of jurisdiction will allocate that money, not this resolution. But without this resolution, we can't move forward. Why is this resolution important? Without this bill passing, Senate Concurrent Resolution 7, there is no hope of getting money for the border the way it needs to be done. Without this resolution passing tonight or early tomorrow, we're not going to get any money for the military without having to negotiate non-military spending increases. We don't have a lack of spending problem in our country. We have spent way too much on things that don't matter enough. Part of this process will be committees finding offsets, reducing spending. So we're telling the Armed Services Committee, spend $150 billion the way you see fit. We're telling 2 committees to spend $175 billion to secure our border, and we're telling 7 other committees, find savings inside your committee to offset the spending we're creating in this bill. I think they can do that. I think what DOGE is doing is good. This is a form of that. Every committee that's been instructed to save at least $1 billion will be able finally to go into the committee itself, what they spend on, and reduce spending because we're directing them to. My hope is that the $342 billion we're going to spend to secure our border, help the military, enhance the Coast Guard, will be offset with $342 billion of cuts in other parts of the government. We can do it, but this resolution has to pass or we won't do it. I'm highly confident that the Republican chairman of the committees in question will deliver. I'm highly confident that we can find savings in the government to offset the spending we're creating. The Democratic Party used this process for the Green New Deal. They used this process for Obamacare. We're using this process to help our military, who needs help, to secure a border that's been broken, and enhance the Coast Guard. That's the difference. We're doing things that need to be done to make us safe. 3,000 Americans die every 2 weeks because fentanyl comes across the border. We're going to fix that. Since President Trump's been in office, border crossings have gone down by 90%. We want to reinforce its success. We want to finish that wall. We want to make sure we never release another person in this country because we don't have a bed. We're going to make sure that the criminal gangs keep leaving, not staying, because the ICE doesn't have enough money. Why are we doing this? Because Tom Holman and Mr. Voigt, the head of OMB, told us 2 weeks ago we're out of money to finish the job that President Trump started. To my House colleagues, I prefer one big, beautiful bill that makes the tax cuts permanent, that does the things we need to do on the border and with our military, and cuts spending. I wish you all the best. I prefer what you're doing to what we're doing, but we got to have a plan B if you can't get it done soon. What is the Senate doing? We've decided to front-end load security. We want to cut taxes. We want to make the tax cuts permanent. We're going to work with our House colleagues to do that. They expire at the end of the year, but we have time to do that. It is the view of the Republican Senate that when it comes to border security, we need not fail. We should have the money now to keep the momentum going. When it comes to the Republican Senate, we believe the military needs money now because the world's on fire. To my House colleagues, we will all get there together. If you can pass the one big beautiful bill that makes the tax cuts permanent, not 4 or 5 years, then we'll all cheer over here. Nothing would please me more than Speaker Johnson being able to put together the bill that President Trump wants. I want that to happen, but I cannot sit on the sidelines and not have a plan B. This nation is under threat. The illegal immigrants who have come here by the millions need to be sent back by the millions. The border needs to be secured. The wall needs to be finished. We need more detention space. We need to upgrade our military capability now. The reason we're doing it now is because we were told ICE is out of money now. So I'm hoping that the House can deliver, but I am very confident that the Senate, early in the morning, Republicans, not one Democrat vote, will set in motion a process that will transform our border security to the most modern, aggressive border security plan in the history of the country, north and south, that will set in motion $175 billion of new spending to secure the border in a way that's never been achieved in the past. If this resolution fails, God help us all. If this resolution passes, help is on the way. If you believe that America needs to be serious about securing our border, this bill gets the job done. If you believe the military needs to be stronger, not weaker at a time of threat, this bill gets it done. If you believe the Coast Guard needs more capability to deal with drugs and national security threats, this bill delivers. This is a security bill. This is a bill that will combat fentanyl killing Americans. There are more Americans dying every 2 weeks from fentanyl than on 9/11. Hundreds of thousands of young Americans, young and old, but mostly young, have died from fentanyl poisoning coming across that southern border. We're going to go after those cartels. I'm confident that President Trump is the new sheriff in town that we need. But without resources, it won't work. Tom Homan came to us and begged us for money to continue the plan he's enacted to get gangs out of this country, to secure that border, to have more detention space. Tom, we heard you. We're going to meet your needs. So I'm excited about this debate. I'm excited about Republican-led committee chairmen, finding ways to reduce spending to pay for this. This is a big deal, folks. The Republican Party is going to go all in on border security. We're going to upgrade our defense capability, and we're going to pay for it. Anybody at home ever had to pick between two things? You couldn't be everything, you couldn't have it all, that you had to spend because your child got sick or hurt, and you had to cut somewhere else because there wasn't enough money to do both. We're going to set priorities. If you have a sick child or something bad in your family happens, that goes first. That means you have to pinch somewhere else, except in Washington. Well, that model's over. We're going to start a new way of doing business. We're going to spend on things that need to be done and should be done by the federal government to keep us safe, and we're going to offset it by reducing spending in areas not as important. I'm excited about this process. I urge my colleagues to come down on both sides of the aisle and participate in this debate. This is what I was elected to do, I think. Make America safe and prosperous, and do it in a fiscally responsible way. The idea that we're going to actually offset spending is a great day. We're going to deliver. This is going to go into the night. Our Democratic colleagues are going to have a chance to offer a lot of amendments to our approach. And they will want this and they will want that. But what breaks my heart is they don't see the value in what we're trying to do. Every American should want more money into DHS to secure our border. Every American should want more capability in the hands of the military at a time of great threat. But we can't get there. We can't reach common ground on those issues. So we're going to use the process they used. They used the process to create Obamacare, the Green New Deal, the Inflation Reduction Act. We're going to use that very same process to make the cartel's life miserable, to go after criminal gangs, to finish the wall, upgrade the capability of the Coast Guard, and make our military the most lethal it's been since Ronald Reagan. And we're going to pay for it all. Huh? They said to wait. What? In a bit, not now, I've been told, I will read a script that starts the process to the senator from Ohio, the presiding officer. This is why you came. This is what you promised to do. I was on the campaign with you, and you looked your voters in the eye and said, we're going to do things differently. We're going to secure our border. We're going to stop the fentanyls from poisoning your kids, and we're going to be serious about fiscal responsibility. We're going to pay for all this. So, Mr. President, you have a chance here to do what you promised you would do. And all of us on this side of the aisle, people are counting on us. They're counting on this Republican majority to deal with the mess that's been created for the last 4 years. They're counting on this Republican majority to give the president the money he needs to do the job that he promised to do. And we're going to deliver. We're going to do it, and we're going to do it tonight. And if it's 5 o'clock in the morning, I don't care how long it takes, we're going to deliver. And we're going to pay for everything we do. So in a little bit, in a small period of time, around 5 o'clock, we're going to start this process. And this is a big deal, folks. This is just not business as usual in Washington. This is a different way of doing business. I yield.
Mr. President.
I recognize the senator from Washington.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, we need to be focused on solving problems, and I think most of us here get that. No matter who the president is, our constituents expect us to work for them. They expect us to fight for them, and they expect us to do the hard work of passing laws to make their lives better. People don't send us here to make their lives worse, but that's exactly what Trump and Musk are doing. They are looking at our most pressing problems and making them worse. And this budget proposal will only add fuel to that fire. Right now, even as egg prices hit an all-time high, Trump and Musk have done nothing to lower prices. They've done nothing to address the housing crisis or help families get quality, affordable childcare, or address other issues I hear about from folks all the time. Instead, they are slashing programs that help our families make ends meet. They are gutting an agency that saves working people money and protects them from scams, and starting trade wars that will impose what is effectively a Trump sales tax entirely on the backs of American workers. As China works to strengthen its global leadership, Trump and Musk have ceded the ground almost entirely, illegally, cutting off investments we make to continue our country's leadership and help our allies. At the most precarious moment for the Middle East in decades, Trump is casually proposing to ethnically cleanse Gaza so that Trump and his family can build waterfront property there. When it comes to helping our allies in Ukraine secure a just peace, Trump is giving away countless concessions to Putin out of the gate, calling our ally a dictator and meeting with Russia without inviting Ukraine. When it comes to the bird flu, Trump and Musk are firing the very workers who are responsible for tracking the disease and keeping it from spreading further. And now suddenly they are desperately trying to hire them back. And as Texas deals with a serious measles outbreak, Trump's health secretary can't even confirm the obvious and tell parents the vaccine doesn't cause autism, which, to be clear, it does not. And almost unbelievably, just weeks after the deadliest commercial plane crash in the U.S. in over 2 decades, Trump and Musk are firing FAA workers who make sure flying is safe. Who does that help? And now Trump is letting Musk run wild by inappropriately accessing and rifling through sensitive SSA and Treasury files, with IRS being next, your data. How does that make sense? But while President Trump is busy making problems worse and trampling our laws and quoting dictators, what are we doing here in the Senate? Are we holding President Trump accountable? Are we holding his co-president, Elon Musk, the richest man in the world, who has billions of dollars in conflicts of interest, accountable? Are we putting a stop to the catastrophic cuts and reckless firings that are hurting people and our communities and setting our country back decades? Seems to me that would be a good use of time. After all, I've even heard some Republicans admit that cutting things like medical research and firing people like our VA workers are bad ideas. So you would think maybe we could work together from that common ground. But instead, Republicans are throwing all their effort behind a partisan plan to slash and burn programs that help our families and raise costs for everyday Americans and shovel billions of dollars to help people who already have billions of dollars. Meanwhile, I would like to recommend to my colleagues, we are less than a month away from a deadline to pass bills to fund our government. And as we approach that deadline, the entire world is watching as President Trump and Elon Musk shut the government down bit by bit, whatever parts Elon doesn't like. Trump and Musk are already showing thousands of our essential workers the door, despite the fact that they have no clue what those workers do or why their jobs matter. They're just turning off the lights and hoping for the best. I am hearing so much alarm from this from back home, from fired workers and from the people who do depend on them. Trump and his co-president are shuttering entire agencies. They're locking workers out of their devices and out of their buildings and demanding the work of the American people come to a screeching halt, again, for no good reason. And let me really drive home just how damaging and extreme these firings are, because we're not talking about some routine changing of the guard or some thoughtful or strategic plan to make government more efficient. Trump and Musk are just taking a wrecking ball to the U.S. government. They don't care what they smash up, they don't care who they hurt, and they don't seem to have any idea just how painful this is for American families. We are talking about tens of thousands of people and counting being pushed out the door without any plan and without any justification beyond Trump and Elon just want to slash and cut with reckless abandon. This has nothing to do with making government more efficient. It's about breaking it beyond repair. Fundamentally, this is not about cutting waste or curbing fraud. Instead, this is about putting the federal workforce into trauma. That's what OMB Director Russ Vought callously put it. So they are mass firing hardworking women and men, many of them veterans, whose only mistake was serving our country, serving our communities, and believing they wouldn't get stabbed in the back by a wannabe dictator and the richest man in the world. And setting aside the fact that many were illegally fired and without real cause, it's not just the workers who are suffering because of this. These cuts undermine essential services for the American people, right down to some of the most basic functions of government. Trump and Musk are firing people who help Americans find quality, affordable health insurance, people who help small businesses get a loan, people who help communities and families get back on their feet after a disaster, and people who help Americans get their tax refunds. They are firing people who help our economy stay competitive, from firings that undermine energy projects and thousands of good new jobs, to firings that undermine innovation and technology, to firings that are hurting our farmers and undermining agricultural research. They are laying off national park rangers, which will mean longer wait times, dirtier bathrooms, delayed emergency responses, and closed parks. They fired Forest Service workers who are crucial to preventing wildfires. And again, I have to emphasize they are firing FAA workers, for crying out loud, including personnel who work on radar and landing and other critical infrastructure that help our aircraft navigate safely. They are firing these people and pretending it's no big deal, all just weeks after, by the way, the deadliest crash our nation has seen in decades. Trump and Elon might not fly commercial, but the rest of us do. In the Pacific Northwest, the Bonneville Power Administration is losing hundreds of highly skilled workers, and that includes everyone from electricians, engineers, dispatchers, line workers, cybersecurity experts, and many more. These are literally the people who keep the lights on. And now they're being fired on a whim because Trump and Elon Musk do not have a clue about what they do and why it's important, and you know what? They don't care to learn. They don't even seem to understand, actually, that these positions are funded by ratepayers, by all of us who live in the Northwest. They are not from federal funding. Trump and Musk have even fired over 1,000 VA workers, including people who are doing life-saving research for our veterans, research to prevent veteran suicide, build life-changing prosthetics, address opioid addiction, and more. These layoffs will mean longer wait times for veterans to see their healthcare providers. It could mean ongoing clinical trials coming to a sudden stop. It means delays getting your disability claim approved, because Trump and Musk went ahead and fired clinicians and claims raters, even while today the current backlog of disability claims is over 250,000. That's not just a betrayal of these public workers, it is a betrayal of our women and men who have served us in uniform. And it's also worth noting, many of the workers being fired are veterans themselves. Trump is firing veterans. And let's not forget the thousands of NIH researchers who are having their research thrown into jeopardy. And the patients who are watching President Trump carelessly toss their best hope for a cure into the shredder. Or CMS experts, they're working on improving maternal health outcomes so fewer pregnant women die in this country. And medical research layoffs aren't the only ones putting American lives at risk, because Trump and Musk are firing public health workers who respond to disease outbreaks. Cybersecurity experts who protect our critical infrastructure, sensitive systems, and our data. Scientists who make sure our water and our air are clean and that we are ready for extreme weather. Workers that help our communities prepare for, respond to, and recover from disasters. Not to mention members of law enforcement who help stop violent criminals. And of course, our nuclear engineers. Seriously, people who manage our nuclear weapons stockpile were being fired by the hundreds with no real strategy. And we know there isn't a strategy, because then Trump and Musk frantically turned around and rehired many of them. And we also know they haven't learned their lesson, because they just did the exact same thing to our workers who are responding to bird flu. Reckless layoffs followed by, wait, no, come back. That's not a plan. That is not a plan. To callously fire people who help us stay ahead of deadly diseases, maintain a safe, secure, and reliable nuclear weapons stockpile, that is the height of dangerous incompetence. And nuclear cleanup work has been hit as well. I've been fighting to get more resources for the Hanford cleanup in Washington State for years. It is already understaffed. And now Trump is actively making things worse. I have heard directly from workers at Hanford who've been laid off, even after some were recognized just this past year for their outstanding work. And by the way, that underscores another reality of these firings. They have absolutely nothing to do with merit. In fact, the way they are targeting new employees, including people who were recently promoted, so now these workers are getting fired from their newly earned jobs, literally pushing out some of our best performers and our most committed workers. And one more thing, they are even illegally firing the government watchdogs who provide accountability and prevent fraud. If Trump and Musk were really committed to tackling waste, fraud, and abuse, would they fire the very people serving in nonpartisan roles whose very job is to uncover and reduce waste, fraud, and abuse? If they were really interested in transparency, would they have torn down websites where the public can find information about agency spendings and policy? The list of pointless, actively dangerous firing goes on and on. It grows by the day, as does the fallout and alarm being caused by it. My phones have been ringing off the hook, and I know I am not the only one. Again, these sweeping layoffs do not address fraud or waste. They are totally arbitrary, pushing out high performers and the promising next generation of our federal workforce who won't be easily replaced. Not to mention the hiring freeze prevents them from even trying. And here's the thing that is so important to remember. These are people who have families. They work hard. They love their country. They're not being sent packing because they've done anything wrong or because their work is not important. They are being pushed out simply because Trump and Musk are trying to break the government, trying to make it not work for the people who need it. It is wrong, and if this doesn't stop now, it will be catastrophic. The scale and scope of Trump and Elon's purge will set our country back decades. It's not like you can fire anyone and say,